Mark found it in a dusty antique shop tucked between a stack of forgotten records. A tape recorder, clunky, heavy, with worn-out buttons that clicked too loudly. Something about it felt wrong, but as a horror writer, he thrived on the eerie and unsettling. He bought it without a second thought. That night, curiosity got the better of him. He inserted a cassette and pressed play. At first, only static, then a faint voice, raspy, slow. "Mark," he froze. Mark sits at his desk. The voice continued, describing his every move. Mark's hand trembles as he listens. He looks over his shoulder. The room is empty, but he knows he is not alone. His blood ran cold. The tape clicked off. Silence filled the room. Then, with a mechanical whir, it rewound itself and played again. Mark leans closer. Too close. He shoved his chair back. The voice laughed, distorted, inhuman. "You should run." The lights flickered. His breath hitched. From the corner of his eye, he saw it. The shadow standing behind him, reflected in the darkened window. Mark had always been a collector of strange things. His apartment was littered with oddities. Old books with handwritten annotations, Victorian dolls missing their eyes, paintings whose subjects seemed to shift ever so slightly when he wasn't looking. The tape recorder, though, felt different. It wasn't just an eerie object. It felt like it had a presence, a weight that settled uneasily in his hands as he carried it home. That first night, he examined it under the glow of his desk lamp. The casing was scratched, the buttons stiff, but the reels inside still turned. A single cassette was already inside. The label was yellowed and blank. No indication of what it contained. He hesitated before pressing play. Static crackled. Then the voice spoke. It knew his name. It knew where he was. The words followed him, narrated his actions as if the speaker were watching from the shadows. When it whispered, "You should run," Mark's skin prickled with an instinctive fear. He turned off the recorder, his heart pounding, but that was only the beginning. The next night, he woke to the sound of something shuffling in the dark. The recorder sat on his desk, unmoving, but the tape inside it was rolling. He hadn't pressed play. He hadn't even touched it. The voice spoke again, soft and deliberate. Mark turns over in bed. His breath quickens. He listens. He wonders if the voice is real. He tells himself it isn't. But Mark, a pause. He could hear his own breath in the room, mirrored by the whisper. He bolted upright, his lamp flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally long against the walls. He turned off the recorder, but the tape kept moving. The voice, now distorted, almost amused, muttered, "It's too late. You should run." Over the next week, the recorder became a parasite in his life. He tried to throw it away, once in the dumpster behind his building, once in a river 3 miles from his apartment. Both times, he found it back on his desk the next morning. The whispering continued, but it no longer just narrated his movements. Now it told him things he hadn't done yet. Warnings, prophecies. Mark will wake at 3:15 a.m. to find his front door open. Mark will hear footsteps that do not belong to him. Mark will see the thing in the hallway, waiting. He tried to ignore it. He locked his door. He left all the lights on. He refused to listen to the tape. But at 3:15 a.m., his door creaked open, and the thing was there, What stood in the dim glow of his bedside lamp was not entirely human. It was tall, too tall, with joints that bent at wrong angles. Its face was obscured by something like smoke, shifting and writhing, but the eyes, deep, hollow voids, locked onto his. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The recorder on his desk clicked on by itself. "Mark," the voice cooed, "please now. You should run." He ran. Sarah Langley had always been drawn to forgotten things, dusty books, abandoned houses, paintings whose brushstrokes whispered untold stories. As an art teacher, she believed every piece of art carried something of its creator within it. That was why, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, she found herself inside a dimly lit thrift store, sifting through a clutter of old frames and canvases in the back corner. Her fingers brushed against something rough. She pulled out a large, faded canvas, its frame chipped and worn. The painting was simple yet unsettling. A vast field of misty gray, tall grass bending under an unseen force, and in the center stood a faceless man, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale void where a face should be. The longer she stared, the more a cold unease crept over her. "Creepy, huh?" The store clerk chuckled behind her. "That one's been here forever. Nobody wants it." Sarah hesitated. She had seen disturbing art before, but something about this painting called to her. It was unfinished. It needed her. Without another thought, she bought it and brought it home. That evening, she propped the painting against her living room wall and sat back with a glass of wine. The faceless figure in the foggy field intrigued her. Who had painted it? And why had they stopped? She ran her fingers over the brushstrokes, feeling the uneven texture. It was old, yet it smelled faintly of fresh paint. Odd. She shook the thought away and turned off the lights before heading to bed. At midnight, she woke with a start, a sound, soft, almost like a brush sweeping across canvas. She sat up, heart pounding, but her apartment was silent, just the wind rattling the windows. She told herself. Still, she felt an uneasy pull to check the painting. She tiptoed into the living room, flicking on the light. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was different. Its faceless man was closer. Blinked. No, it had to be her imagination. Paintings didn't move. Maybe she just hadn't noticed the figure's exact position before. She swallowed hard and turned away, refusing to let her mind play tricks on her. Each night, the painting shifted. The faceless man edged forward, step by step. The mist grew thicker, as if swallowing the landscape. Then, by the fifth night, new details had emerged. Shapes in the background, barely visible through the fog. Silhouettes, figures. Watching, Sarah stopped sleeping. She took the painting off the wall, shoved it into the closet, and locked the door. But the next morning it was back, resting against the wall as if it had never been moved. And then, on the seventh night, she saw it herself, a small figure in the distant background, barely formed, standing at the edge of the field. A frozen scream caught in her throat. She stepped back, knocking over a chair. Something was different. Its faceless man was closer. Blinked. No, it had to be her imagination. Paintings didn't move. Maybe she just hadn't noticed the figure's exact position before. She swallowed hard and turned away, refusing to let her mind play tricks on her. Each night, the painting shifted. The faceless man edged forward, step by step. The mist grew thicker, as if swallowing the landscape. Then, by the fifth night, new details had emerged. Shapes in the background, barely visible through the fog. Silhouettes, figures. Watching, Sarah stopped sleeping. She took the painting off the wall, shoved it into the closet, and locked the door. But the next morning, it was back, resting against the wall as if it had never been moved. And then, on the seventh night, she saw it herself, a small figure in the distant background, barely formed, standing at the edge of the field. A frozen scream caught in her throat. She stepped back, knocking over a chair. That night, it was waiting for her when she got home. She stopped leaving the apartment. She stopped answering her phone. The figure in the painting drew closer every night, and so did her own reflection within it. She could see her face now, her wide, terrified eyes staring back at her from inside the frame. On the 14th night, the faceless man had almost reached her. Sarah sat in front of the painting, eyes hollow, body trembling. The mist swirled around the two figures now, her and the faceless man. The background silhouettes had drawn closer, waiting. The air in the apartment felt heavy, thick with something unseen. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the light flickered. A whisper. She turned her head slowly. The faceless man was no longer in the painting. He was behind her. A scream never left her lips. She was in the painting. Panic gripped her. She tried to paint over it, but the brush wouldn't hold color on the canvas. She tried to burn it, but the flames wouldn't catch. She even drove out to a distant lake and threw it into the water, watching it sink beneath the surface. The next morning, the painting sat untouched in the thrift store once again, waiting for its next owner. And in the distant background, among the swirling mist, a new figure stood, her face frozen in silent horror, forever trapped within the unfinished painting. Just as the title states, I clean abandoned houses for a living. I'm quite proud of myself, as I have worked hard starting my own business at just 24 years old and building it to what it is now. I specifically targeted these types of cleaning jobs, as you can charge much more than your average 1 to 3 times per week house cleaning jobs of inhabited homes. Plus, I rarely ever have to see anyone other than my team while on the job. Over the years, I have really been in some insane situations with these houses. Everything from encountering wild animals to once a deranged squatter taking up residence in the homes I clean. There is one house that stands out from the rest, however, one that haunts my dreams to this day. I got the job offer through a real estate agent I made my friend over the years in this business. I rolled my eyes again. Death in the houses I cleaned was nothing new to me, and Amelia was well aware of this. Amelia continued. I cut my pre-visit to the house short last week. Didn't even make it upstairs, where the grandmother apparently passed. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming in this one. It's a small home, not much clutter left. Amelia, my real estate friend, said over the phone. Shouldn't need more than 1 or 2 of you to complete the clean, she continued in her enthusiastic voice. That got my attention. Amelia had been in real estate longer than I had been in the cleaning business, and she took her pre-get-to-know before showing visits very seriously. Anyway, I recommended your cleaning services to the granddaughter, and she agreed right away. Do you accept? She finished. I rolled my eyes. I hated when she used her customer service voice on me. Yeah. What's the real deal with this house? I answered in my usual half-annoyed tone. Amelia responded more normal this time. Honestly, Lori, this house gives me the creeps. The granddaughter inherited it a couple of years ago, but has just recently decided to sell. The grandmother apparently died in the house. Yes, I accept the job. How soon can we get in to clean? I answered, feeling somewhat excited. Tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. As I mentioned, the granddaughter removed most of the clutter from the house, but it still needs a good TLC cleaning. A key will be left under the welcome mat, Amelia said, back in her customer service voice. My eyes rolled yet again as I ended the call. Finally, an interesting clean, I thought as I then dialed Morgan. The next day, my most trusted cleaner and best friend, Morgan, and myself drove up the horribly overgrown driveway and saw the well-aged small house come into view. Surely, they will need to hire an outside maintenance and renovation crew, I thought as I climbed out of my cleaning van. Morgan whistled as we stepped on the small creaking porch. You sure just you and I can handle this, Lori? Morgan asked as I fetched the house key from the weathered porch mat. If the outside is anything like the inside, we need the whole damn team, Morgan stated as she stood behind me. Amelia is over the top, but would never underestimate a cleaning job, I answered as I slid the house key into the old lock and turned until I heard the lock give way. I then pushed the door open as it made the usual ominous creak. We were both silent as we stepped into what I assumed was the small living room. The musty smell of a far too long closed-up house filled my nose as my eyes scanned the darkened room. Just as Amelia said, not much was left in the room. A couch took up most of the room on the right. A small wooden coffee table sat directly in front of it, coated in a thick layer of dust. I noticed a few photographs still clung to the walls. Let's get the supplies from the back of the van and get started, I said over my shoulder to Morgan. I have dinner plans and want this done long before. A bit later, I was scrubbing the dirty windows of the living room while Morgan opted to start upstairs. Lori, I heard Morgan call from up the stairs located just behind me. What? I called back. It was silent for several minutes as I waited for a response. I felt my aggravation growing as Morgan did not respond. I threw my rag on the floor and wiped my sweating brow as I turned and headed towards the stairs. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed to the upper floor. You better have a damn good reason for interrupting me and not answering, I yelled as I reached the final step. Goosebumps covered my skin when I stepped onto the old wooden floor of the upper level. Weird, I mumbled to myself as I looked around. The upper level was a small hallway. 2 rooms were located on each side as I peered down the dark corridor. Morgan? I called in a softer voice this time. No answer. I slowly headed down the hallway, wishing I had thought to bring my flashlight. I always hated working with no electricity, but it came with the job. I could see the light of day from the open door on left side of the hall. The other door on the right was closed. As I looked into the open door on the left, I saw Morgan standing still looking at the bed located on the far side of the room. It moved, Morgan said in an almost whisper. Huh? I answered as I walked in and stood beside her. The bed. It moved on its own while I was cleaning the floor. Morgan said, still staring down at the bed. I then noticed the bed was crooked now. The bottom was several inches away from the wall, where the top was still flush with the corner of wall. Do you see it? Morgan then said even softer now. I almost couldn't hear her. Instead of questioning her, I looked down towards the bed that her eyes were glued to. I instantly saw what she was talking about. There was an imprint on the bed, the shape of a body, as if someone was laying on the bed that very moment. It was silent for several minutes as I waited for a response. I felt my aggravation growing as Morgan did not respond. I threw my rag on the floor and wiped my sweating brow as I turned and headed towards the stairs. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed to the upper floor. You better have a damn good reason for interrupting me and not answering, I yelled as I reached the final step. Goosebumps covered my skin when I stepped onto the old wooden floor of the upper level. Weird, I mumbled to myself as I looked around. The upper level was a small hallway. 2 rooms were located on each side as I peered down the dark corridor. Morgan? I called in a softer voice this time. No answer. I slowly headed down the hallway, wishing I had thought to bring my flashlight. I always hated working with no electricity, but it came with the job. I could see the light of day from the open door on left side of the hall. The other door on the right was closed. As I looked into the open door on the left, I saw Morgan standing still looking at the bed located on the far side of the room. It moved, Morgan said in an almost whisper. Huh? I answered as I walked in and stood beside her. The bed. It moved on its own while I was cleaning the floor. Morgan said, still staring down at the bed. The chills were really covering my body now, and I felt myself actually shivering. It felt like someone was staring up at us directly from the bed. I slowly reached for Morgan's arm and gently pulled her towards me. Let's go back downstairs. We will finish the bottom floor together, I said, matching her whispering tone. Morgan didn't respond, but obeyed my request. The feeling of eyes on us did not leave as we headed down the small hallway to the top of the stairs. I had to fight the urge to run down the flimsy steps. Once we were safely down in the living room, the air somehow felt easier to breathe, if that makes any sense. What the hell was that? Morgan demanded, finally sounding more like herself. I ignored that question. Look, you know I hate skimming on jobs, but let's get this level done and get the hell out of here. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and headed to the next room, which was a small kitchen. Morgan stayed close beside me as we worked in silence, cleaning the sink, counter, and cabinets. We both froze after hearing what sounded like footsteps above us. Don't, I said in a warning tone as I went back to cleaning dust and mice droppings from the cabinet. Morgan again obeyed and stayed silent as she went back to work on the counter. The footsteps continued moving around above us on and off as we quickly finished in the kitchen. The last room branched off from the kitchen that appeared to be a small office. I was so relieved we would be out of there soon. This room had stained and worn down carpet covering the wooden floor. I turned on our rechargeable vacuum, and the loud buzzing sound almost deafened me, but I was glad for it. Working in eerie silence was not normal for us, as we usually chatted and listened to music but I was too rushed to fool with conversation or a playlist right now. What the actual hell? I heard Morgan yell out over the sound of the vacuum. I jerked my head up to see Morgan staring up at the ceiling, looking terrified again. Just as I cut the vacuum off, I heard what she had to be referring to as the buzzing sound died down. I can only explain it as the choking or coughing, gurgling sound of an elderly person. It was only for a split second I heard it, but that was enough. "Screw this," I yelled as I grabbed up as many of our supplies as I could. Morgan joined me in grabbing up the rest. We dashed out of the office, through the kitchen and living room, and out the front door. I was pretty much sprinting to the van, while trying not to trip on the mess of the yard. Just as I got to the van, I heard Morgan shout, "Wait!" I turned to see her a few feet behind me. I left my supplies upstairs. We also didn't finish cleaning up there. We didn't even clean the bathroom, which must be up there. I'm not charging the freaking client. We can buy new. Whatever supplies are left, get your ass in the van. I didn't wait for a response as I jumped into the driver's seat. Morgan hurried and threw the supplies in her arms in the back and slammed the door. I took one final look at the house as she slid into the passenger seat. I couldn't be sure, but it almost looked like someone was peering out of one of the two upper windows. I started the van. Hearing it roar to life was pure heaven in that moment. I floored it out of the driveway and back into town. I later called Amelia to explain the job was not complete and I would not be charging. The granddaughter would have to find someone else to clean that nightmare. It was only last night I dreamt I was in a bed, staring up at an old, cracked, and familiar ceiling. I felt weak and frail as the weight of someone crawling on top of me took the air from my lungs. I felt cold hands around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter. That awful gurgling, choking sound coming from my mouth being the last thing I heard as I woke up in a cold sweat. The marks are still visible on my throat today. Mark found it in a dusty antique shop tucked between a stack of forgotten records. A tape recorder, clunky, heavy, with worn-out buttons that clicked too loudly. Something about it felt wrong. But as a horror writer, he thrived on the eerie and unsettling. He bought it without a second thought. That night, curiosity got the better of him. He inserted a cassette and pressed play. At first, only static, then a faint voice, raspy, slow. "Mark," he froze. Mark sits at his